Okay, I want to ask the other side of Barbara's question. We don't have any geographers here, as far as I know, and so the geographer's question is what's the utility? What's the importance of space? That space is often used as a stand-in for other things that you don't measure. So especially in quantitative studies, and often in ethnographies, it just happens to be a context that gives you a convenient boundary of what you're doing, and maybe or a way to look at unmeasured variables. And we talk about this as the importance of space. But geographers talk about space in a very different way. They talk about it partly in terms of place, which is, they make the distinction between space and place. But you're in the assumption to talk about different levels of scale. Scale is itself a concept, but there's also, is there something about space that is inherently interesting or inherently theoretical that's irreducible to other concepts?
I mean, thank you for that question. Because in fact, that's the first thing one would think about, right? When you think about what area studies is essentially problematization of space. And it's both the cause and effect, because it's really space in the most unreconstructed way. I mean, the way that it was meant, right? There's this area of people and culture. Let's just go in and study it. And it's really old-fashioned idea of space as container, which as Soja and others have very successfully, I think, torpedoed. But I think space, to me, is also it's a theorization of place. I think one reason that people have singled out place as very cautiously singled out is because place is more this affectively charged, like home, right? Homelessness, anything in diaspora studies would tend to really insist, or even the kind of politics Dina's talking about. I mean, place is incredibly important. So I see that as kind of the empiricism versus theory problem, even within geography. And I find that it's more the intersection between talking about space and scale that is most useful. And in that sense, space also, I mean, scale tends to look at space in different ways as well. It's an interval, it could be something overlapping, modulating, so on and so forth. But I think ultimately, but what I just reiterated sort of comes out geographers who are very aware of the fact that ideas about space and area study comes out of this extension of the American empire. But I would actually juxtapose that. I see that, and I raise them a different kind of geography, which, let's say, 19th century introduction of geology and geography into China by Western missionaries, and also the idea of borderland studies in China that I see as almost kind of a counterpart, or maybe a counterpoint to area studies, but because borderlands really, well, it's really the Chinese empire and ethnicities, ethnic minorities on the border, so on and so forth, interaction, historical interaction with them. So I think these are very different ideas of territoriality immediately, right? Like area studies, like sending out like offshoots of, undercover agents to report back. And borderland studies we're still very much anchored in the idea of centrality. Why is that ever in doubt? And we're only interested in those who really butt up right against us, like adjacent. So I think already that's a very different organization of the way we think about space and power.
It's tough to follow that up. I mean, I think that, I guess scale level analysis to me is a methodological issue, and then thinking about space and place is more of a theoretical issue, right? So I think about, the folks that theorize about space and place and why it matters are really focusing on what's going on in a particular place, in a particular community or neighborhood. So, of course, one person that I think about is Rob Sampson's work at Harvard, right? He's really pushed forward this idea about neighborhood effects. But he's also done a lot to actually look at what's happening within these neighborhoods, collecting large-scale data sets that ask individuals about what they think about their neighborhoods, but also sending people out to do observations of neighborhoods. Is there trash on the street? Are there people hanging out on the corner? So we can get a better sense of what's going on at a broader scale. But he also talks about what's happening within communities, such as one of his big concepts is collective efficacy, right? The extent to which individuals are willing to intervene if they see that there's something going on, that people are, trying to steal from their neighbor or something. So he talks about how the processes that are happening within these spaces and places are really important to predicting things like crime, well-being, and different other sorts of outcomes. And so I guess I see, again, space and place. We have to think about it in conjunction with the level of analysis, but without the theorization, I think that for sociologists, it wouldn't make sense to talk about levels of analysis without the theory. So that's just to give you a flavor, I guess, of how I'm thinking about it.
So I'd like to extend a little bit the comments that John, Barbara, and Bill just made, because I think that all three of these comments are getting at something that actually that Sandy also got at 2 weeks ago in response to a question that Marla asked about school integration. And that is that there are real problems in conceptualizing locale as space when we, in fact, mean something different. But we're using space as a metaphor, or maybe in measurement terms, a proxy for something else. So when John said that the SSRC said we're not going to do area studies, but we're not sure what we're going to do instead, I'd like to speak to what the instead is. What is that other thing? And that other thing, I think, is that people can be socially local as opposed to as distinct from spatially local. They can also be, by the way, temporally local. You can be local in time in the sense of a cohort. We're the class of 2011. We're not just here in Palo Alto. But beyond spatial and temporal, there's being socially local. And this is what I think Barbara is getting at with the idea of an online community. And you can see it in Bill's work where local has nothing to do with, spans both time and space. And so how is that possible? Here's what the provocative thing I want to suggest and throw back to you is that you actually don't really mean space when you speak about local. And especially I think that's true for you, Dina, because you really try to insist on it is space, it is local. But I want to suggest to you that it actually may not be, and that what's really going on when we talk about, when social scientists are talking about local, is we're talking about people being embedded in dense clusters of interaction. And those tend to be, and it is often the case that when you don't have good measures of people's relationships, you can use spatial proximity as a kind of crude proxy to pick that up. But this is what you really mean. And let me tie this back to Sandy's comment in response to a question that Marla asked 2 weeks ago about segregation. So when you segregate us, so we were talking about schools being integrated, and Sandy reminded us, because we all know this, but it's easy to forget it, he reminded us that yes, but the schools then resegregate internally. And where do you go find that segregation in the schools? It's not just in the classrooms, it's in the cafeteria, that's where you see it. It's in the interactions in which people become embedded, the dense interactions. And I think that's really what goes on in the inner city, and that's what Wilson is really talking about when he talks about the context effects that keep the truly disadvantaged from being able to move out. Those context effects are transmitted through social interactions with peers and parents. And so what I want to throw back to you then is that we should not think that you're both actually much more similar than you realize, because you're both using local to mean spatially local. You're both thinking of scale as like a Google map that you can zoom in and out of. But what you really both mean are dense clusters of social interaction in which individuals are embedded. Let me just throw that out and let you respond.
Do you want to go first?
I don't think I would disagree. And I think, when I gave my definition of what I mean by local context, I talked about communities, neighborhoods, and areas of interaction. And I think I think you're right that sociologists, and me included, that the way that I've operated or tried to think about my research, I haven't had the data that really shows me, what are the specific connections, right? What do the network ties look like? And I think it's been so kind of widely accepted, and maybe it shouldn't be, that there are particular measures that we use to try to capture, just like you're saying, to try to capture these interactions and network and community ties. But we're making assumptions about what they actually mean, and they are crude measures. But we theorize about why they should matter, and then we also think about the mechanisms through which these associations should work, which have a lot to do with embeddedness, connectedness, ties. So I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying. And I guess for me, it's a data issue. And it's interesting because I'm, as an aside, I'm starting a new study in Philadelphia that really is getting at these network connections and ties, and I just hadn't thought about it before, just because I've been working at a particular level of analysis to do my work, and I'm making assumptions about what's happening when groups are segregated from each other, or when they're in contact with each other with these much cruder measures. But again, that's why I think the qualitative is really important. I mean, we can also get network data. That's another way to do it. But that's why I think the qualitative is important. I'm finding these associations. Is it because these groups are actually connected to each other? What do the ties look like? How do they navigate these situations? So I wouldn't disagree, Michael. Jing?
I agree with Dina that I wouldn't disagree with that either. No, because I appreciate that description, that definition that we're really looking at in the kind of social interaction that's embedded in sort of dense clusters. But I don't think neither one of us was really talking about specifically in the very unimaginative kind of spatial oriented communities. But just to be, although I don't agree with you, I can be hair splitting and ask, well, what is this idea of being embedded in dense cluster of interaction? What does that tell us exactly? I mean, what is the critical import of putting it in that way? Because in some ways, isn't it more important to think about how they're drawn? Like, how does density happen? It's more the process of concentration, of gathering around a particular scale, particular local place-based politics. I mean, you would think something like the internet would just give birth to an entirely different kind of literature, because there's nothing that can be more, I think, apt for what you're talking about, socially local, right? Than that kind of literature. But in fact, people still talk about very traditional things. They talk about the rise of China, how it's going to decimate, Caucasian population around the world, for one thing. And those that are really true to the media of internet, I mean, the sense of being socially local, it's kind of science fiction. So in some ways, on the one hand, yes, I think there's a difference here between what we know conceptually and maybe in a technological way, what the potential things might be. But there's also the very inconvenient fact of how people actually practice that. And sometimes I tend to think of the relationship between technology, globalization, and the individual actors and who actually occupy them, is that it's kind of like wearing shoes that are way too big for you at the moment, right? That we're still kind of bound by the physical size of our feet than the roominess of this new technology. So I think that's something that needs to be accounted for. So in that sense, I mean, I would like to hear more about how the idea of looking at clustered interaction, like how does that bridge that space in a shoe for us?
Yeah, we're having a dense set of interactions over here. So I almost don't know where to begin because I feel like I'm representing my local group. But I would say I think local is maybe the wrong word for what Michael is describing, and that may be confusing a set of distinct and potentially equally important processes. And I think part of the mini discussion going over here is that the local does matter in ways other than simply or in addition to the dense ties that may or may not be created there. And but I wanted actually to go back to an earlier point, and that is how the notion of scale and levels interacts with notions of how we think about these things, both as social scientists and humanists. And I just wanted to defend sociology and the social sciences in general, in saying that I don't think that it's about seeing human beings as some simple, straightforward creatures who have a belief or opinion or whatever and then act on it. And I actually think the questions that you're raising have a great potential for looking at the very sense of ambivalence of being torn between different levels of being human beings being, in a sense, bombarded with competing desires, goals, expectations, messages. So I think that fits with the debate we're having about the importance of space versus other dimensions and the importance of local, meso, global, whatever. So I'd be curious just to hear you talk more about that, not about how we can draw simple boundaries here or make some sort of straightforward predictions, but about how those increasingly complex interactions at the global and local level are really changing the way we see ourselves as members of groups, both competing groups or in some cases potentially unified groups.
I like that very much. I was hoping you would say or change how we think of ourselves as members of a particular discipline.
Oh, well, actually, I did mean to say that too. I forgot about the humanities versus social sciences, but certainly I think it's I think both dangerous, and we lose a huge potential when we draw these strict boundaries and we see the disciplines as defining human beings in such different ways.
I absolutely agree with that, and which is why, to me, there are these two parts of what I'm working on now that I'm trying to reconcile, which is precisely there are things that thinking a more structured, kind of larger social, thinking through larger social structures help us illuminate things that literary studies can't about what's going on in the literary world that is Chinese speaking or Chinese language related. But then there's also this inconvenient fact of these individual writers and the things they write about, right? These affects, these emotions, these longings that actually figure into their relationship to this changing landscape, global landscape of Chinese literature, that in some ways, looking at social structures and institutions can't tell me. So, I mean, I don't think the two, I think there's very fruitful ground for the two to interact on this. So I don't at all think of those lines. I need to stress that when I say these lines, talk about these as though they're kind of categories somehow fixed, it's really in part, it's in part because we think in these terms, or we have been. I mean, we know we shouldn't, but in fact we still do and write as though we do. But also because people are invested in them. And that is writers, readers, literary critics, the world, the kind of things that make human interactions human are very much invested in these sort of old-fashioned, unreconstructed, maybe even anti-evolutionary concepts and categories. I mean, we like categories, and we somehow need them to feel a sense of belonging or to feel a sense of stability. So it is true that, to me, to think about larger social structures does not relieve me from the responsibility, and I think the need to also think about what anchors individuals, right? What do they hold on to? And I think that actually takes us down several notches from the theoretical and gets us more on the ground with people who, for instance, don't have the voice to speak for themselves and don't even have the critical vocabulary like we do to reflect on what their state of sociology is.
I have a comment about the value of area studies. This is kind of coming off of Rachel's comments. It seems to me that there are two characteristics of the academic culture of area studies that are important. One of them is interdisciplinarity, because this is one of the places where you, in a rare way, have sustained contact between people in different dimensions. And I think that a tendency to try to understand social phenomena in a whole context, I'll come back to that word, that requires knowing something about the culture, the political structure, the economics, and so on, and how they relate to one another. And the other value of area studies is depth of knowledge of particular cases, right? That's connected with the value of knowing the language and, studying history of particular countries, let's say. I mean, even if there are questions about whether nation is the right unit. I do comparative analysis, and I've been having a lot of debates with people who are doing, the kind of big statistical comparative analyses where you have lots and lots of cases spread all around the world. And it seems to me that in the problems you have with those kinds of studies, you can really see the value of area studies, because there are just tremendous problems of the validity of measurement, for example, or the thinness of the kind of theory that you often wind up with that just seems to be stretched too broadly to say very much. So it seems to me that what area studies is about, in a way, is about context and trying to think about both theory and measurement operationalization on the basis of a knowledge of the context. And you can, these kinds of large-scale studies can be very valuable, but if you don't have a base of people who know the particular cases really well, you don't have any way of knowing whether you're making valid measurements or not, whether the theory really makes any sense or not.
Thank you very much for that. So let that be a lesson to all of you theorists out there beyond this room, right? Context matter. But I think you're absolutely right, because the only problem that, because we think of, area studies, context, that's so boring. That's so like 1960s or something. But this actually has a much greater methodological implication for everything that we do, right? How to have that kind. In fact, I would argue that area studies had a much more flexible range of context-specific analyses than outside of it, because we're used to thinking about things in relationship to other. The field was bombarded with theory. I think it would be rational choice for poli-sci, the political science component, area studies, world systems theory for sociology, and post-structuralism for, let's say, literary studies, anthropology. So for the past several decades, area studies was bombarded with these, where you have to, it very uncomfortably negotiate the fact of having to use these theory as a stuff out of which they might generate their own sense of academic identity or some kind of conceptual sophistication. But I think in the process, what they ended up doing is to manage to think incredibly flexibly about alterity or otherness or whatnot, with a much greater sensitivity and historical nuance than these theories were able to generate out of their own context. I am actually often appalled by when I think about talk to humanists and about these brilliant theories that they come up with, and I realize it's only based on a handful of literary texts that we already know, or certain canonical, additions. And it's a great testimony to the imagination of the human mind that you can do that kind of thing. But I think to really make it substantive, that is to say, to have that broad range, to precisely do this kind of bridge building that all of us that we're interested in doing, you have to acquire that interdisciplinarity, those different dimensions that I just will remind you, area studies was originally designed to do, right? That is the original interdisciplinarity. I mean, how great is that? Here's an area, go in, swim in. The difference is, and I think that's why it has a leg up, because it's not about going at a problem with an already made theory, with this attitude of, let's see what you got. What are you going to show me that I already know? But it's actually to look at the problem and to understand that you need to develop a set of conceptual tools that will help you engage with it and to understand its nature and raise new questions. I mean, that to me is a much more, isn't it obvious what the difference would be? I mean, we always tell our students, you don't go in with preconceived frameworks. But what area studies do is give you these fresh problems, right? That's about other cultures, other contexts, other histories, and say, now you do something with it. So you're not gonna go at it with your rational choice or your deconstruction. I mean, you can. In fact, people have done that for the past couple of decades. But it's not going to get you very far. And that's the kind of exhaustion that I think people in area studies, kind of fatigue and impatience that has felt with what these proper established disciplines can actually bring to the table.